Surge of unarmed civilians and then gunfire. And this was the result. The Palestinian protesters removed their dead and injured, and then a smaller group stood ground in this bunker freshly dug by the Israelis. With razor wire ahead and the military concentrating their sights on every move, this was a standoff which would go no further. It became a sit-in protest. It wasn't on the scale of Nakba Day action last month, when hundreds successfully breached the border at the Golan Heights, territory taken by Israel from Syria in the Six-Day War of 1967. Most of more than a dozen people killed had been crossing the border with Lebanon. This frontier, now a closed military zone. Nakba protests called off and a labour strike instead imposed in all Palestinian camps in Lebanon. In Kalandia, in the occupied West Bank, there were clashes between Israeli soldiers and youths. At least 5 were injured. But here in East Jerusalem and the rest of the Palestinian occupied territories, there's been relative calm. Nakba Day isn't traditionally marked by major protest by Palestinians. Border protests such as this confronts Israel with something it's never been faced with before. Unarmed civilians prepared to risk their lives for their cause. Andrew Simmons, Al Jazeera, East Jerusalem.
Earlier, my colleague Hida Fakhri spoke to the Israeli government spokesman Mark Regev and asked him how so many unarmed civilians could be shot dead.
I'd remind you that we, through loudspeakers, urged them not to approach the border. We fired shots in the air. We did all the regular police things. We only fired live rounds as a last resort when these people simply couldn't be stopped.
Well, you call them a mob. All reports suggest that they were unarmed civilians simply approaching that demarcation line, and soldiers opened fire at them. They were throwing stones, hurling some rubbish across the fence, but no one apparently crossed it. Are the soldiers on edge, or do they have clear, specific orders to shoot and kill?
No, their orders are to act with the greatest possible restraint. But as you yourself said, they were throwing rocks and other projectiles. They were trying to force their way into our country. And once again, I'd remind you, there's a legal state of war between Israel and Syria. And these people are enemy nationals. They're trying to force their way into my country. Obviously, I think any member of the United Nations would have acted as we did. You just can't force your way into a country. Now, they were warned, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, and yet they still persisted.
But they weren't forcing their way. They weren't forcing their way into a country. This isn't Israel's border. You know as well as I do that the Golan has been occupied since 1967. It is quite irrelevant if Israel has annexed it or not. It remains a territory that was illegally captured by force in 1967.
I think you're terribly wrong, if you don't mind me saying so. There is a United Nations buffer force separating Israel from Syria, and I think we are clearly on our line. I'd urge you to ask the United Nations before you say such things that are simply ridiculous.
Well, there are also
trying to force their way into
UN Security Council resolutions that talk about the Golan Heights being occupied territory.
No, but your point is, you're saying there is a UN force which is on the other side of the border. It's clear they were trying to break in forcibly into Israel, throwing projectiles, rocks, trying to do damage. They were repeatedly warned not to do it. I would ask, these are enemy nationals. How did you expect us to respond? Enemy nationals violently trying to break in to my country. Did you really expect any other response? They were warned repeatedly.
Sir, I was not talking about a UN
Israel,
force.
not to approach the border.
I was simply taking you on the point that where you mentioned that this was Israel's border and that they were trying to break into that border. All reports from the area say that they were simply waving Palestinian flags. They threw rocks, threw some trash over the fence, but did not attempt to cross it. If you are showing maximum restraint, how do you then explain the killing of so many unarmed civilians?
First of all, we have to look and see exactly what happened on the ground. When people are violently trying to enter your country to tear down the border, and don't take my word for it, look at the pictures. Look at the interviews these people have been giving. They say deliberately, we are going to tear down the border fence and enter Israel. I mean, it's very clear exactly what happened. And I would ask you, you have people who are violently trying to enter someone else's territory. We are within our total legal rights to prevent that from happening. They were repeatedly warned not to do so.